Okay, computer science practice test number 3. This is free response question number 2. Um, all these questions actually were from last year's AP test, so very good practice. This is a good question where you have to create the whole entire class, which is a pretty common thing and something that should be covered this year, even without some of the content being covered. So I think this is a really good one. This has a lot of the basics, and some of you guys are missing some easy points and not thinking about some special cases that we should address. This question involves the implementation of fitness tracking system that's represented by step tracker class. Step tracker object is created with a parameter that defines the minimum number of steps that must be taken for data considered accurate. So a step tracker object is created with a parameter, one argument constructor. Okay, when you create something, use the constructor. This has some key information in it that's going to be re-emphasized later. So even if you missed it at this point, you should pick it up later. The minimum number of steps that must be taken to be considered active. That's all the constructor takes. Okay? So no steps are going to actually be added or days added initially, but you do need that argument. It's the one thing you need. Step tracker class provides a constructor and the following methods. So you definitely need a constructor, one of them, and these methods. Add daily steps, active days, average steps. Add daily steps accumulates information about steps in readings taken once a day. So we're going to add some steps and then update stuff. Active days returns the number of active days. So it's really just kind of a getter because we should probably know how many active days there are when we add daily steps. That's the point you should be checking. Average steps returns the average number of steps per day, calculated by dividing the total number of steps by the number of days tracked. So there's some key words in here that I think are going to help you identify things that we're going to need to keep track of that will become our private instance variables. So there's definitely the minimum number of steps to be active. There's also the number of active days we need to keep track of. There's the total number of steps for all the days, and there's the total number of days total. So I think there's 4 clear things that we're interested in. Now, I would read through this whole table because they're going to show you how it works, but they're also going to point out maybe some special cases that you should be like, oh, I got to make sure mine does that. The following table contains sample code, execution sequence, and the corresponding results. So here they create a step tracker. 10,000 steps is the minimum number of steps, but we actually haven't added any steps or any days. So if you were to do active days or average steps, they'd be 0. Now we're going to add 9,000 steps. Now that's not enough to be active. Add 5,000 more. Still not enough to be active. It's got to be in a single day to be active. Now, if you do active days, there's no active days, but average steps is going to be the total steps, 14,000 divided by 2. Now it's got to be a double. It's got to be a double, okay? Because we're going to get fractions of steps per day. But that 0.0 tells you it's got to be double, okay? So we got to remember when we calculate the average that we're calculating a double and we're returning double, but we're also not losing any information by accidentally doing math with ints, which most everything else is going to be ints, right? Add daily steps 13,000. Well, that's an active day. Now, if you do active days, there's been one active day. Average steps is going to be the total number of steps. We're up to 27,000 divided by 3. We add another 23,000, and that's another active day. And now we're up to 50,000. Then another 1,100, and that is non-active day. So now we're up to 51,111. Number of days is 5. And here you see clearly your average steps has to be a double. Okay. Now, one of the things to think about earlier, just in case, now, usually the way we calculate an average is by taking a total and dividing by the number of days. So probably total steps divided by number of days, pretty simple. The problem is if there's 0 days, it's still supposed to return 0.0. But if you divide by 0 in Java, same thing will happen. That happens in math. It's going to be undefined. It's going to be NaN, not a number, and you're not going to get a valid return statement. So we're going to have to actually check if there's 0 days before we do that calculation. And that's something that a lot of people miss, but there's only one point. So this is a whole class. So usually there's a free response problem out of the 4 where you get to just write the whole class. And I think you guys should love these because there's a lot of points given for basic things. Okay. So first we've got to start with the header, public class step tracker. It's got to be public. Okay. Now, usually you get a point for that. This time they didn't give you a point for that. So then we need to do private instance variables. Now, I already talked about the ones, the things I think we need to keep track of. There are maybe some really creative ways, a lot more work to maybe somehow keep track of these things without private instance variables. I saw one person do an array list and kind of successfully almost pulled most of them off, but it was complicated. It'd be a lot simpler to be like private int, active steps. That's what I'm going to call it. That's the number of minimum steps. So I'm just going to call it active steps. These have to be private. If you don't say private, you're going to lose the credit. You should not be initializing them here. We're just declaring them. We definitely need total steps. So we need active steps. That's the criteria for an active day. And then total steps is just how many steps. Now, we don't need a variable for the steps in a single day because the step tracker isn't trying to just keep track of information for a single day. They're keeping track of everything. We also need to keep track of the number of days. There's a couple different days. There's active days. So I called it number active days. I used very descriptive variable names, and then also the total number of days because we need that for the average. So I'll just call that one number days. So this was a point that had to be private. You had to have all the instance variables. Next is the constructor. We've done this so many times this year. Public step tracker. There's no return type. It's not a method, even though it kind of looks like a method. And they told you, and if you look at the example from the previous page, look at every time, well, right here where they created it, it took a single argument. And they told you up here, object is created with a parameter that defines the minimum steps. So it should only be a single argument. Some people started giving me lots of arguments or no arguments. You have to say what kind of argument it's going to be. I'm going to just call it the same thing, active steps. Kind of like that. It's kind of a popular thing to do. But now when I initialize in here, I have to say this dot active steps because this active steps is a local variable, which is different than the private instance variable. But you can do that. If you don't say this dot, then it assumes you're talking about this local one. But that's it. Now, just because that's the only argument doesn't mean we should initialize all the private instance variables. So we should say, you could say this dot if you want, but it's not necessary. Total steps equals 0, right? Number active days equals 0. Number days equals 0. You need to initialize them all. So points here, got a point for the header, easy points. You got a point for initializing private instance variables, which is kind of basic. Now, they did say if you didn't initialize these other ones, which means that they'll get the default value, which happens to be these values. In Java, it's a lazy, it's a kind of a shortcut way of doing it. They went ahead and gave you the point if that's all you did, as long as you declared them up here. So, got lucky. but I would just do it anyways. I mean, that's what they show in their solutions too. Now we got to go through and do those methods. So, I mean, we can look at the previous page and say, okay, well, we need to add daily steps, which is kind of the main thing to add some. And then active days and average steps are really kind of like subsequent to that. Like, so public, and it says add daily steps accumulates information. It doesn't return anything. This says returns. This says return. So if it doesn't say it returns anything, then it's probably void. So it's got to be public void add daily steps. Okay, can't be private. And then it's got to take some steps. It says that you're supposed to, add some steps. So I called it daily steps, add daily steps. It kind of seems obvious that we should probably give it some daily steps. That's where the point, just the header. Now, when we go into it, there's a couple things we need to update. Providence is variable. Total steps is going to increase by the daily steps, right? Plus equals is a little shortcut for where you could write total steps equals total steps plus daily steps. That's what that means. But just a little shorter. Number of total days, right? Number of days. Plus, we just need to increment it by 1. We just added 1 day's worth of steps, and then we should check if it was an active day. This is your opportunity, because this daily steps is going to disappear after this. You're not going to be able to do it in another method. You're not going to be able to check if it's active in the getter. The getter is just active days is just a getter. This is where we figure it out. As we add the steps for a day, we got to figure out if it was an active day. So we say if daily steps greater than, now this is a mistake that a bunch of people made, or equal to, I called it active steps. Some of you guys called it min. The minimum is the barrier. It doesn't have to be greater than the minimum. It has to be equal to or greater than. So if you miss this or equals to, you're going to lose a point. Now you got a point for updating those Providence variables, and then you get 1 point for this. This would be this would be, according to my names, number active days plus. Okay, doesn't return anything. So if you miss this or equals to, you lose this point. If you didn't update your Providence variables, you missed it. The next method on the list was active days, that returns the number of active days. This is the simplest one. Public, it returns number of active days, which is an integer. Active days. It takes no arguments. And you just return number of active days. So there doesn't need to be any algorithm here. The algorithm's in the daily steps, and this is worth 1 point total. So if you mess up the header, there should be no. And here's the other way to verify if it takes any arguments. Look on this list where they call it active days, no arguments, right? Value returned. It returns an int. If it was a double, they put 0.0 on it. Okay. And then the last one was public, and this is average steps. So every time they did average steps, it's 0 arguments, but it returns a double. Okay, which kind of makes sense for an average. Maybe give a decimal. So it's public double. You have to say the return type. Average steps, no arguments. Okay. Now, most people, did the total number of steps divided by the number of days, which has one issue. If you just do total steps by number of days, those are probably ints, and they will give you an int. Even if you assign them to a double, you'll lose the double information. It'll be made into a double, but too late, and then you'll return the wrong type. And so you lose that point. Now you get plus point just with the header, and then it's just 1 point for the rest of it. It's really easy to lose this last point. You also need to make sure you don't divide by 0. So if number days equals 0, this is the thing that most people missed. You have to return 0.0. Okay. Else, we could return. Now, what we have to do to make sure it comes out a double is we got to cast one of the numbers in the arithmetic before it's done to a double. So that could be the numerator or the denominator. So you could do double total steps. Now, what would be good to do is to make sure that happens first. If you're at all wondering the order of precedence in Java, what order it does things as you type it, you can still force it to, just like in math, to do certain things first. If you're at all not sure, divided by number days. Now, the alternative is you could have cast the denominator instead, and Java will, if one of the numbers is a double, it will treat the other as a double in the calculation. Okay. What some people did is they did this. They said, and now, by the way, okay, so we got to return it. So you got 1 point for all that. You got to return it. You got to make sure you don't divide by 0. Now, this is what some people did. They did total steps in parentheses by number of days, which actually messed it up. If you didn't put the parentheses, I think you might be okay. But what this does is this does an int divided by an int, which will give you an int. You'll lose the remainder, and then you're going to make that into a double, which is fine. Now you return double, but you're not returning the right answer. So you got to make sure that you make one of them a double before you do the calculation. Otherwise, you'll get an int, even if you change it to a double later. So that was that problem. I think this is a problem that if you get anything like this on your AP test in a week and a half, that hopefully this is one that you get a lot of points on. There wasn't a whole lot of complicated algorithm stuff in here. There were a couple things, but most of the points for getting headers right, doing basic things, constructor, private instance variables, getters, updating private instance variables, and, the add daily steps is essentially a setter, So, and of the problems on this test, I felt like this one was kind of a more straightforward one. So let's make sure we can get these right on your AP test next week.